February 22, 1945, the Roer River Valley, Germany. Dawn breaks cold and colorless across the flooded lowlands, the kind of gray morning that makes men question whether the sun still exists. In the pre-dawn darkness, American artillery crews stand motionless beside their guns, breath forming small clouds in the freezing air. They wait. Behind them, stretching back for miles, columns of Sherman tanks idle with engines cold, their crews huddled inside against the bitter wind. No one speaks. The only sound is the distant rush of swollen river water and the occasional cough of a soldier trying to stay warm. This is the calm that precedes annihilation. Across the Roer, German defenders of the 338th Infantry Division peer into the mist from concrete bunkers and fortified positions. They believe they are safe. The river, they have been told, is impassable. Allied engineers cannot bridge it. The floodgates upstream at the Schwammenauer Dam have been destroyed by their own forces, turning the Roer into a churning barrier of brown water 15 feet above normal levels. For 2 weeks, this torrent has protected them. For 2 weeks, they have watched the Americans wait on the opposite bank, helpless. The German soldiers smoke their dwindling cigarette rations and tell themselves they have time. The fatherland will send reinforcements. The miracle weapons will arrive. They just need to hold. They do not know that in 8 days, 20,000 of them will be dead, captured or fleeing in blind panic through villages they swore to defend. They do not know they are about to witness something their training never prepared them for, something no amount of ideological fervor can withstand. They are about to encounter the silent storm. The story of what happened along the Roer River in late February 1945 is not widely remembered. It lacks the dramatic imagery of D-Day, the turning point clarity of Stalingrad, the moral weight of the concentration camp liberations that would come weeks later. But for the German soldiers who survived it, those 8 days represented something more terrifying than a single battle lost. They experienced the methodical, unstoppable machinery of American industrial warfare operating at full capacity. They felt what it meant to fight an enemy that could replace every lost tank, every expended shell, every fallen soldier faster than they could count them. They learned that courage and conviction mean nothing when the other side can simply exhaust your ability to resist. This is the story of Operation Grenade, the crossing of the Roer River and the subsequent drive to the Rhine. But more than that, it is the story of a specific kind of power that the Wehrmacht had never truly faced before, a power that did not announce itself with speeches or symbols, but simply appeared everywhere at once, overwhelming and absolute. The German High Command understood rivers. For centuries, European warfare had been shaped by them. Rivers were natural fortifications, choke points where smaller forces could hold against larger ones. In February 1945, as the Allies pushed toward the Rhine and the heart of Germany itself, every river became a potential line of resistance. The Roer was not the widest or the deepest, but it was swollen with winter rains and strategic demolitions. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commanding German forces in the west, knew he could not stop the Allied advance permanently. But he could slow it. Every day the Allies spent on the wrong side of a river was another day to evacuate equipment, to reposition forces, perhaps even negotiate some kind of armistice that would preserve something of the Reich. The plan was simple: destroy the flood control dams, turn the Roer into a temporary moat, buy time. On February 10th, German engineers blew the discharge valves on the Schwammenauer Dam. They did not destroy the dam itself, which would have sent a catastrophic wall of water downstream and subsided within hours. Instead, they opened it just enough to create a steady, sustained flood that would last for weeks. The river spread across its floodplain, turning roads into mud, creating a barrier nearly half a mile wide in some places. German commanders estimated it would take the Americans at least 3 weeks to attempt a crossing. By then, reinforcements from the Eastern Front might arrive. By then, anything might happen. What they failed to calculate was the sheer volume of bridging equipment the Americans had already positioned behind the front lines. They failed to imagine the industrial capacity that had produced not just enough pontoon bridges to cross the river, but enough to replace them, if destroyed, and enough left over to cross the next river and the one after that. They failed to understand that American logistics operated on a scale that made European military thinking obsolete. The German soldier in his bunker on the east bank of the Roer had been told about American material superiority. He had seen the bomber formations that blotted out the sky, had felt the earth shake from artillery bombardments that lasted for hours. But seeing and experiencing are different things. In his mind, he still believed that German tactical skill, German fighting spirit, could compensate for numerical disadvantages. He had been taught since childhood that will, properly directed, could overcome material circumstances. The mythology of the Eastern Front reinforced this. Stories of small German units holding against Soviet hordes, of panzer crews destroying dozens of T-34s through superior tactics and training. The German soldier believed that Americans, soft from prosperity, would break when pressed hard enough. He believed his commanders when they said the Roer could not be crossed quickly. He believed fundamentally that he was fighting for something real, while the Americans fought for nothing but wealth and comfort. On the morning of February 23rd, at 0245 hours, that belief system began to collapse. The artillery barrage started without warning. Not the sporadic shelling that had characterized the previous weeks, but a coordinated bombardment involving over 1,000 guns firing simultaneously. The sound was not a series of explosions, but a single sustained roar, as if the earth itself were tearing apart. German positions disappeared under curtains of high explosive and white phosphorus. Bunkers built to withstand direct hits shook until concrete dust filled the air, and men could not hear their own screaming. The barrage lasted 45 minutes, and in that time, American guns fired more shells than the entire German artillery reserve on the Western Front possessed. Then, silence. For 30 seconds, nothing. German soldiers in the surviving positions lifted their heads, ears ringing, trying to understand if it was over. Some reached for their weapons. Some simply stared into the darkness, beyond thought. Then they heard the new sound. Outboard motors, hundreds of them. The assault boats were coming. The crossing happened in darkness and in fog. The Americans using smoke generators to blind German observation posts even further. Entire infantry battalions crossed in the first wave, not probing cautiously, but flooding across in overwhelming numbers. German machine gunners fired blindly into the murk, hearing screams that confirmed hits but unable to stop the tide. For every boat destroyed, 3 more appeared. Within 2 hours, the Americans had established 6 separate bridgeheads. By dawn, engineers were already assembling the first pontoon bridges under cover of smoke and artillery fire that never truly stopped, simply shifted targets deeper into German territory. A German lieutenant, captured on the second day, would later tell interrogators, "We thought you would need days to cross. You did it in one night." We thought destroying the bridges would stop you. You built new ones faster than we could shell them. We thought we understood war. We did not understand this. This was the silent storm. Not silent because it was quiet, but silent because it came without ideology, without theatrics, without the need to proclaim its power. It simply was. Overwhelming, methodical, inevitable. The German defenders along the Ruhr had been trained to expect certain patterns of warfare. An assault would begin with reconnaissance, then probing attacks to identify weak points, then a main assault concentrated at those weak points. This was how war had been fought for generations. This was logical. This was how the Wehrmacht itself operated when it had the resources to attack. But Operation Grenade did not concentrate force at weak points. It applied overwhelming force everywhere simultaneously, making the concept of weak and strong points irrelevant. By February 24th, the Americans had 15 bridges across the Ruhr. Not pontoon bridges that might wash away or collapse, but reinforced structures capable of handling tanks and heavy vehicles. German artillery tried desperately to destroy them. But American counter-battery fire was so accurate and so sustained that German guns could fire only a few rounds before being silenced forever. Luftwaffe aircraft attempted sporadic attacks, but were intercepted by fighter patrols that seemed to be everywhere at once. The few planes that got through found the bridges protected by anti-aircraft batteries so dense that flying into their range was suicide. A German corporal from the 59th Infantry Division, writing in his diary on the third day, recorded, "They are not fighting us. They are burying us. There is no battle, only this endless pressure from all sides. We fire until our ammunition is gone, then we retreat, then we are surrounded." Yesterday, my company was 120 men. Today, we are 43. We have not fought a battle. We have simply been crushed. This was the psychological dimension of the silent storm. The German soldier had been conditioned to think of war in terms of heroic struggle, of Kampf, the battle that tests and reveals character. But there was no struggle here, no test. There was only attrition operating at an industrial scale. The Americans did not need to outfight the Germans. They did not need superior tactics or braver soldiers. They simply needed to maintain pressure until German units ceased to exist as functional organizations. The American supply system made this possible. Every day, trucks brought forward ammunition, fuel, rations, and replacement equipment in quantities that German logistics officers could barely comprehend. The U.S. Army in Europe consumed more supplies in a single day than the entire Wehrmacht had available in its forward depots. An American infantry division could sustain combat operations indefinitely because behind it stretched a supply chain that extended back across the Atlantic Ocean to factories producing material around the clock. When an American tank was destroyed, another appeared within hours. When a battalion took heavy casualties, replacements arrived before the survivors had finished burying their dead. The Germans had no equivalent system. Every shell fired was one less shell available. Every tank lost was gone permanently. Every casualty depleted units that could not be refilled. By early 1945, the Wehrmacht was operating on fragments and hope, scavenging equipment from disabled vehicles, mixing teenage conscripts with exhausted veterans, defending a nation that could no longer feed its army properly. Food. This was the symbol that would haunt German survivors of the Ruhr crossing for years afterward. Not weapons, not tanks, but something as simple as food. On the fourth day of the offensive, February 26th, American forces captured the town of Erkelenz. The battle for the town lasted 6 hours. German defenders, elements of the 12th Volksgrenadier Division, fought from house to house until they ran out of ammunition, then retreated north toward Mönchengladbach. When American troops secured the town and began clearing buildings, they found abandoned supply depots and field kitchens. The rations left behind told a story more devastating than any combat report. The Germans had been eating sawdust bread. Not bread containing sawdust as a supplement, but bread where sawdust was the primary ingredient, held together with minimal flour and potato starch. Their coffee was roasted acorns. Their meat ration for an entire company for one day consisted of 3 pounds of horse meat, gristly and half-rotten. An American sergeant, supervising the cataloging of captured supplies, wrote to his wife, "These people are starving. I don't mean hungry, I mean genuinely starving. And they're still fighting. I don't know if that makes them brave, or crazy, or both." When American units set up their field kitchens in Erkelenz that evening, the smell of cooking food drew German civilians from cellars and hiding places. What they saw broke something in their understanding of the war. The Americans were cooking fresh meat, real meat, beef and pork, in quantities sufficient to feed thousands. There were crates of canned vegetables, barrels of white flour, boxes of chocolate bars, and cigarettes distributed freely to the troops. And the American soldiers ate like it was an ordinary Tuesday in peacetime. Like food was something that simply existed in unlimited quantities, like scarcity was a concept from ancient history. A Wehrmacht major, captured during the fighting in Erkelenz, was fed in an American mess tent before interrogation. He was given more food at that single meal than his ration allowance for an entire week. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes with real butter, canned peaches, white bread, coffee with sugar and cream. He ate mechanically, unable to process the absurdity. When the interrogation began, the American intelligence officer asked routine questions about unit strength and defensive positions. The major answered everything automatically, but what he remembered afterward, what he told other prisoners in the camp, was not the interrogation. It was the food. He said, "They are not richer than us. Rich is the wrong word. They are from a different world, where the things we fight for do not exist because they have always had them. How can you defeat people who do not know what hunger is?" This was the psychological weapon the Americans wielded without even knowing it. The material abundance was not propaganda. It was not a show staged to impress prisoners. It was simply how American forces operated normally, a baseline condition so fundamental that the soldiers themselves took it for granted. To the Germans, this abundance represented something almost supernatural, a kind of power that could not be matched because it came not from will or courage, but from a system so vast and productive that individual sacrifice became meaningless. The symbolic power of American food spread through the German ranks faster than any battlefield defeat. Soldiers who encountered American supply dumps found crates of oranges, fruit most of them had not tasted in years. They found warehouses full of new boots, entire pallets of warm clothing, medical supplies in such quantities that the Americans sometimes left them behind when advancing because they knew more would arrive tomorrow. Each discovery reinforced the same terrible realization. This war was not a contest between equal powers momentarily out of balance. It was a mismatch so fundamental that all the courage and tactical skill in the world could not overcome it. By February 28th, 5 days into the offensive, the German defensive line along the Ruhr had ceased to exist. American forces had advanced up to 20 miles beyond the river, capturing or destroying the equivalent of an entire German Army Corps. The 9th U.S. Army, which had conducted the main assault, reported enemy casualties exceeding 15,000 killed or captured, with estimates of additional thousands wounded or deserted. American casualties, while significant, were being replaced faster than units could process the new arrivals. The mathematical reality was simple and brutal. The Americans could sustain this level of attrition indefinitely, and the Germans could not survive another week of it. What made Operation Grenade particularly devastating was not just the initial crossing, but the sustained momentum afterward. In previous offensives, Allied forces had sometimes paused after breaking through to consolidate gains, allowing German forces to retreat and reform. Not this time. The Americans had learned that the Wehrmacht in early 1945 was brittle. Once broken, it could not heal. So the advance continued without pause, columns of tanks and mechanized infantry pushing forward through day and night, giving the Germans no time to establish new defensive positions. German soldiers who survived the first days of the offensive found themselves caught in a nightmarish cycle. They would retreat to what their maps showed as prepared defensive positions, only to find those positions either already abandoned or so poorly supplied they could not hold for more than a few hours. They would be ordered to counterattack, but the promised tank support never arrived because the tanks had no fuel or had been destroyed en route by Allied fighter bombers. They would entrench and prepare to defend. But American artillery would range in on their positions with such speed and accuracy that defense became suicide. A pattern emerged in the testimonies of German prisoners. They described a specific moment when they realized defeat was certain. A moment not of dramatic revelation, but of quiet acceptance. For some, it was seeing American supply convoys stretching back to the horizon, truck after truck after truck, while their own logistics consisted of horse-drawn carts scavenging for gasoline. For others, it was watching American engineers build entire forward airfields in 72 hours, creating air support infrastructure faster than the Luftwaffe could destroy a single runway. For many, it was simply the relentlessness of it. The way the Americans kept coming, not with fanatic charges, but with methodical, professional persistence that never wavered and never stopped. One prisoner, a sergeant from the 183rd Volksgrenadier Division, tried to explain it to his captors. In Russia, we learned to fear the Soviet masses, the waves of men they could send forward, no matter how many we killed. But they were just men. Brave, yes. But still just men who could bleed and die and eventually stop. You are not men like that. You are something we have no training for. You are a machine that thinks. Every part works perfectly. If we damage one part, another replaces it before we can exploit the weakness. How do you fight this? How do you fight an enemy that never gets tired, never runs out, never stops improving? The Americans did not have an answer to that question because from their perspective, they were not doing anything extraordinary. They were simply executing doctrine, following procedures developed through years of industrial warfare. The U.S. Army of 1945 was a learning organization, constantly refining its methods based on combat experience. Every battle was analyzed, lessons extracted, improvements implemented. The crossing of the Roer incorporated techniques learned at Normandy, refined in the Hurtgen forest, perfected through repetition. This was not genius. It was competence operating at scale. But competence at scale is its own form of genius. The ability to coordinate thousands of moving parts, to synchronize artillery with infantry, with armor, with air support, to maintain supply lines across thousands of miles of ocean and hundreds of miles of combat zone, to process intelligence and adapt tactics faster than the enemy can respond. This required not individual brilliance, but systematic excellence. And systematic excellence was something American industry and American organizational culture had spent decades developing. March 1st, the 8th day. American forces reached the outskirts of Mönchengladbach, the largest city in the region. The German garrison has been ordered to defend to the last man, to make the Americans pay for every street, every building. The orders come from commanders far behind the lines who still speak of honor and duty and the necessity of sacrifice. The soldiers who must execute these orders know better. They have seen what happened to units that tried to make last stands. They have learned that in 1945, heroism is just another word for dying uselessly. As American artillery begins the preliminary bombardment, thousands of German soldiers make individual choices. Some obey orders and take positions in cellars and ruins, preparing to sell their lives expensively. But many others slip away, discarding weapons and uniforms, blending into streams of civilian refugees, choosing survival over ideology. The Wehrmacht is melting, not breaking in dramatic collapse, but simply dissolving as men decide that dying for a regime that cannot feed them is not duty, but absurdity. The battle for Mönchengladbach lasts 2 days, not because of fierce resistance, but because the Americans take time to minimize civilian casualties and preserve infrastructure. When the city falls, the tally for Operation Grenade is complete. 20,000 German casualties in 8 days, entire divisions rendered combat ineffective, the approaches to the Rhine now open and undefended. The Americans have suffered losses too, several thousand killed and wounded. But their combat strength is higher at the end of the offensive than at the beginning due to the constant flow of replacements and equipment. In the prisoner of war cages behind the front lines, captured German soldiers wait for processing. They are fed, not lavishly, but adequately. Real bread, canned meat, coffee with sugar. Many eat in silence, unable to reconcile this treatment with what they had been told about American barbarism. Some weep, not from shame but from exhaustion and the sheer relief of no longer being required to fight. A few maintain ideological conviction, insisting that wonder weapons will still turn the tide, that this is merely a temporary setback. But most simply stare at nothing, processing the fact that they survived, that the war for them is over, that whatever happens to Germany now will happen without them. The American guards watch them with a mixture of pity and puzzlement. These were supposed to be the master race, the supermen of Nazi ideology. They look like scarecrows, hollow-eyed, malnourished, many suffering from dysentery and lice and frostbite. Some are teenagers, some are men in their 50s, scraped from the bottom of the manpower barrel. The guards share cigarettes with them, basic human decency that seems to shock the prisoners more than cruelty would have. One guard writes in his journal, "They expected us to hate them. Maybe some of us do, but mostly they just look pathetic. Like they've been conned into fighting for something that was never real in the first place." This was the final element of the silent storm. It did not need to hate its enemies to destroy them. It operated without passion, without cruelty, but also without mercy in the sense of stopping before the job was complete. The American system would continue to apply pressure until the Nazi regime ceased to exist. Not because of moral outrage, though that existed, but because that was the objective and the system was designed to achieve objectives. The symbolic object that recurs through every account of Operation Grenade is not a weapon or a flag. It is the C-ration can, the small, rectangular tin that American soldiers cursed daily as monotonous and barely edible represented to the Germans something close to miraculous. Food that came in sealed, waterproof, individual portions that required no preparation, that could be stored indefinitely, that existed in such quantities that soldiers sometimes threw them away half-eaten. The C ration was the most visible manifestation of American industrial capacity translated into individual soldier experience. German prisoners examined C ration cans with fascination. The fact that each ration was identical, that quality control ensured every can contained exactly the same amount of food, that the packaging included not just calories, but cigarettes and matches and candy, represented a level of logistical sophistication they could barely comprehend. Their own field rations, when available, consisted of whatever could be scrounged from local sources, quality wildly variable, distribution erratic. The C ration said, "We can produce millions of these, ship them across an ocean, deliver them to individual soldiers in active combat zones, and do it so reliably that men complain about the menu choices." One prisoner, an Offizier from the 59th Infantry Division, told his interrogators, "When I saw your soldiers throwing away food, I understood we had lost. Not lost this battle, lost everything. A nation that can be careless with food can be careless with ammunition, with fuel, with lives even. You have so much that nothing is precious. We have so little that everything is precious. How can precious defeat careless? It cannot. We were doomed the moment America entered the war. We just did not know it yet." This was not quite true. Careless is the wrong word. The Americans were not careless with lives or resources. They were simply operating with abundance rather than scarcity, and abundance enables different strategic calculations. A German commander had to husband resources, carefully calculating the cost of every action because replacement was uncertain. An American commander could be aggressive because he knew support would arrive. This was not carelessness, but confidence rooted in material reality. The transformation in German perception happened at different speeds for different men, but it followed a common pattern. First came denial. This is temporary. We have faced setbacks before. The Führer has a plan. Then came rationalization. We are losing only because of betrayal, or because the Americans are using unfair advantages, or because God has temporarily turned his face from us. Then came the moment of recognition, sometimes sudden, sometimes gradual, that the war was lost and had perhaps always been lost, that the promises of greatness and destiny were lies, that they had spent years fighting for a regime that had doomed them from the start. For some, this recognition brought despair. For others, strange relief. A few maintained conviction to the end, but they were increasingly rare. By March 1945, most German soldiers fought not from belief, but from habit, from fear of punishment, from lack of alternatives. The silent storm did not need to break their conviction, because their conviction was already broken. It merely had to outlast their inertia. The epilogue to Operation Grenade is written in the weeks that follow. American forces push forward to the Rhine, cross it in early March, begin the final drive into the heart of Germany. The Wehrmacht continues to resist, but it is resistance without hope. The thrashing of an organism that is not yet realized it is dead. By May, Germany surrenders. By summer, the full extent of Nazi crimes becomes clear, and the world understands what kind of regime had been defeated. But in the immediate aftermath of the Roye crossing, in those cold March days of 1945, a specific truth crystallizes. Ideology without material foundation is fantasy. The Germans had believed deeply in their cause, had constructed elaborate mythologies about destiny and will and racial superiority. None of it mattered when confronted with a system that could simply produce more of everything than they could destroy. The silent storm did not argue with Nazi ideology. It did not need to. It simply made ideology irrelevant. An American chaplain, conducting services for both American troops and German prisoners, and in the week after Mönchengladbach fell, recorded a conversation with a captured German officer. The officer had been a philosophy student before the war, a true believer in the Nazi vision of a new order. After 8 days of Operation Grenade, he was hollow. He said, "I thought we were fighting for ideas, for a vision of how the world should be ordered. But you're not fighting for ideas. You are fighting from a condition, from abundance and confidence, and the belief that problems can be solved through production and organization. We brought poetry to a mathematics contest. We were trying to prove ourselves worthy through suffering and sacrifice, while you were simply building enough bridges to cross the river. I do not know which is more right, but I know which one." The chaplain had no answer. Perhaps there was no answer. Perhaps the only truth was the one written in the soil of Germany in those 8 days. That freedom is not an ideology, but a condition. That abundance is not decadence, but power. That democracy works not because people are good, but because systems that respect human dignity tend to produce better outcomes than systems based on domination and fantasy. The sea ration can, that humble symbol of American industrial might, contained within its recycled metal walls a kind of philosophy. The world has enough. Enough food, enough resources, enough potential prosperity that no one need starve. That scarcity is a choice, not a necessity. That cooperation produces more than conquest ever could. This was not the philosophy of saints. It was the philosophy of engineers and factory workers and farmers who believed problems had solutions and set about implementing them. Against this, the 1,000-year Reich lasted 12 years. Against this, the myth of Aryan superiority dissolved like sawdust bred in water. Against this, 20,000 German soldiers learned in 8 terrible days that courage is not enough, that will is not enough, that believing you are right does not make you right. And the silent storm that crushed them was not cruelty. It was not even really about them. It was simply the sound of the future arriving, methodical and unstoppable, built in Detroit and Pittsburgh and Los Angeles by people who had never heard of the Rower River, but whose work ensured that when the moment came in America could cross any river, overcome any obstacle, defeat any enemy that confused mythology with reality. In the end, that may be the largest truth. Myths do not defeat systems. Belief does not defeat production. The silent storm was silent only because it did not need to speak. It simply was, and being was enough.